Last time we spoke about the collapse of the First United Front. A quasi-civil war had emerged between the Wuhan KMT government, backed by the CCP, and leftist KMT members, and the Nanjing government, backed by Chiang Kai-shek and the right wing. Chiang Kai-shek unleashed a violent anti-communist purge at Shanghai, breaking ties with the Soviets, prompting them to toss their lot in with Wuhan. Wang Jingwei eventually took over the rival government as he tried to alienate Chiang Kai-shek and squeeze him out of the KMT entirely. Because of the lack of coordination between the two KMT factions, the NPA gradually gained the upper hand and pushed the NRA further south. Then Feng Yusang and his Kuomintang entered the fray, invading Henan. Both Chiang Kai-shek and Wang Jingwei tried to win Feng Yusang over, but Chiang Kai-shek simply had a better deal. Then the Soviets unleashed their own sneaky attempt to get the CCP on top, only to see their advisors and members purged as the Wuhan and Nanjing governments were unified and Chiang Kai-shek surprisingly stepped down. This episode is The Northern Expedition Part 6, The September Government. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before I begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia. Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found at YouTube and all major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I just released a long-form documentary on the First Sino-Japanese War. And as for podcasts, I'm now on episode 5 in a brand new series covering the North African campaign during World War II. If you want to support me personally, why don't you check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all of my content, and voting rights for what I will tackle next. On August the 12th of 1927, Chiang Kai-shek shocked everybody by agreeing to step down. This came just as the NRA were fleeing towards the south banks of the Yangtze, after multiple positions they held in the north were overrun by the NPA. The last rearguard escaped the south bank on August 19th. The NRA had been served decisive defeats. The two KMT factions attempted reconciliation, but they were still very much fragmented. Within the Nanjing regime, many still supported Chiang Kai-shek. When Chiang Kai-shek went to exile, many followed him, such as Hu Hanmin, Tai Yuanpei, Zhang Jingjiang, Wu Zhihe, and Li Xizong. For them, an alternative to the Generalissimo at the helm of the Northern Expedition was simply a no-go. This exodus did not see the others recall Chiang Kai-shek, however. Chiang Kai-shek traveled with his family to Fenghua, near Ningpo, in Zhejiang before he took his ship to Japan. Over in Japan, Chiang Kai-shek met with Prime Minister Tanaka Giichi, discussing the futility of trying to reorganize the KMT. During his time in exile, he would win the hand of Song Meiling, his second wife. They would marry in December the 1st of 1927 in Shanghai. Back over in Nanjing, the situation kept deteriorating. In fact, despite the fact that Wuhan and Nanjing agreed to reunify, they had not officially done so. Deng Shengzhi's forces were still harassing the Nanjing KMT as the NPA continued to use their heavy artillery upon the second capital of China. The NRA had lost the rich lands of Anhui and Jiangsu, north of the Yangtze. Within a do-or-die type of situation, the NRA commanders tried to pull it back together. The Guangxi generals, alongside General Hou Yingqin, the commander of the 1st NRA Army, were defending the southern banks. The Nanjing KMT officials praised Wuhan for purging their communists and called for a plenary session. The KMT all met on August 24th, and both sides began negotiations. However, the military situation kept getting worse. Feng Yusang's Kuomintang suffered defeats in Henan to the forces of Zhang Shuliang, as Sun Quan-feng's artillery pounded upon Nanjing and the NRA positions along the southern bank of the Yangtze. Sun Quan-feng unleashed a particularly heavy bombardment on August 25th, seeking to soften up the NRA so he could launch his own offensive. Sun Quan-feng was actually butting heads a bit with Jiang Zuolin. Jiang Zuolin favored a strategy of gradual containment of the NRA. Basically, allow the heavy artillery to beat them down until they were weak enough for the combined NPA forces to form a front and advance. But Sun Quan-fung wanted to reclaim his lost territory, especially Shanghai, and he could see the KMT were stuck in a sort of limbo. He did not want to wait for them to possibly reconcile, and thus lose him the chance to strike back. As his August 25th bombardment raged on, he launched several landing parties towards the southern banks of the Yangtze. Some of these landing parties were diversionary attacks, but 2 regiments were performing the main real strike. They landed at 3 a.m. on the 26th near the town of Longtan, sitting beside the station along the Shanghai-Nanjing Railway. They secured a beachhead, and their vanguard surged inland while Sun Quan-fung tossed thousands across the Yangtze using an armada of stolen river boats. The NRA had spread their numbers quite thin to be able to man the entire lower Yangtze. Thus, Sun Quan-fung's vanguard were easily able to breach part of the line defended by Li Zongren's 7th NRA Army. The NPA forces were wearing civilian clothing. They spread out as they cut telegraph and railway lines. The town of Longtan was swarmed with riverboats as Sun Quan-fung forged 3 beachheads. As the first day of combat came to a close, Li Zongren was able to concentrate his efforts and drive off Sun Quan-fung's forces who were trying to fortify some hills, and away from the Shanghai-Nanjing Railway. The fighting saw the NRA suffer 800 casualties, but they managed to capture over 3,000 NPA, who were cut off from their comrades. Better yet, these prisoners came with some much-needed field guns. On August 27th, Sun Quan-fung continued to ship men across the Yangtze via his beachhead at Longtan. With new reinforcements, his men managed to capture the railway station. Amongst his troops were some of Zhang Zongchang's elite White Russian forces, who would prove to be devastating if they could acquire armored trains. The NRA reinforced their lines to meet the NPA challenge. Now some 30,000 northern Chinese were defending a perimeter of several square miles between the train station and Longtan. Countless NRA commanders at the front lines telegrammed frantic messages back to the KMT politicians demanding they get their shit together so a real counteroffensive could be mounted. As the battle for Longtan raged on August 28th, Feng Yusung over in the eastern parts of Henan responded by driving an offensive into Shandong province, threatening Caozhou. Sun Quan-fung had basically gambled a significant part of his forces. He knew very well that if the NRA reconciled and coordinated properly, his beachhead would easily be dislodged, but he was gambling they would take a lot of time to do so. On August 30th, Tan Yankai sent a message to Wang Jingwei and Tang Xingzhi from Nanjing asking for their help. Specifically, he wanted them to launch an offensive into Anhui from Wuhan to divert NPA forces. With Chiang Kai-shek gone, it seemed the Wuhan leaders were much more willing to cooperate, so they unleashed an offensive towards Hefei and Anhui. The Wuhan NRA forces sought to outflank the NPA along the Tianjin-Pukao railway line. Further to the north, Feng Yusung's Kuomintang forces captured Caozhou, 70 miles from said railway. From the direction of Shanghai, Ho Yingqin's 1st NRA army began to advance, converging on the eastern sector of Sun Quan-fung's beachhead. Feng Yusung had not been the only other faction to come out of the woodwork to help the NRA. When Feng Yusung entered the fray, he also purged his Kuomintang of communists, crippling the Wuhan government's plans to advance north. Tang Xingzhi's drive north had seen many of Wu Peifu's forces defect over to him. Thus, Wu Peifu took the opportunity when Tang Xingzhi went back to Wuhan to escape with his remaining forces into Sichuan province. From there, he simply announced his retirement. It was a bitter end for the Jade Marshal. Then the turtle warlord of Shanxi, Yan Qishan, agreed to align himself with the NRA. This saw his fresh 100,000-strong army join the war and apply pressure to the NPA. The coordinated efforts against Sun Quan-fung began to show results immediately. The NRA were drawing upon reinforcements as far as Hangzhou, tightening a noose around Sun Quan-fung's beachhead. The NRA Navy also dispatched gunboats Zhujian and Zhudong, preventing Sun Quan-fung from shipping men or materials over the Yangtze. Fighting their way through the enemy perimeter, the 7th NRA Army recaptured Longtan and a railway station for a second time during the night of the 30th. During said night, Sun Quan-fung had gathered nearly 40,000 troops for a pre-dawn counterattack. The counterattack saw his men fighting with their backs up against the river, with little to no chance of evacuation because of the NRA gunboats. Their only hope was to recapture a defensible position, perhaps upon some of the nearby hills, to hunker down and hope for reinforcements or rescue. The counterattack was vicious. The NPA forces were basically trapped like a savage animal. Their counterattacks were so fierce, the NRA realized that by defending the lower Yangtze and attacking Longtan, they might lose control over the entire delta. They could very well be pushed up against the mountainous regions further south. On the 31st, the 1st NRA Army defending the railway station was dislodged under heavy fire. General Ho Ying-chin personally ran along the line, wielding his pistol, shouting if the NPA overran them now, he would shoot himself. Sun Quan-fong then looked on in horror as his forces' momentum began to break and his entire army south of the Yangtze was being battered. His entire army and dream of retaking his 5 provinces, let alone Shanghai, was completely falling apart. His 40,000 troops were cut off, they had no escape route, their flanks were surrounded, his river craft were all sinking to the bottom of the Yangtze. He, alongside his personal guards, managed to escape, but nearly his entire army was left behind. The NRA ended up accepting the surrender of a colossal 30,000 troops, including 10 commanders of brigades, regiments, and divisions. 30 heavy artillery pieces were taken, alongside 35,000 rifles. Perhaps 10,000 of Sun Quan-fong's men had been killed in a 6-day bloodbath. Only a mere 1,000 managed to escape to rejoin his 10,000 men strong rearguard along the northern bank. Where Sun Quan-fong had once fielded 11 divisions and 6 mixed brigades, now remained 3 divisions with a few mixed brigades. It was a hard-won victory for the NRA, and they recorded suffering nearly 10,000 casualties, of which 500 were from the 5th Whampoa Academy class who had just graduated in July of 1926. Despite the severe defeat, the NPA still had resurged, and the KMT were still quite divided. Following Sun Quan-fong's defeat, his decimated troops limped back north onto trains bound for Shandong. Had the NRA been better coordinated, they could have pursued the enemy and managed to take some territory within the North China Plain up to the Yellow River. A NRA vanguard did advance to Pukou, but was forced to pause as much more infighting broke out between the Wuhan and Nanjing governments. On September the 2nd, Li Zongren and Ho Ying-chin had their troops ready to cross over the Yangtze, but awaited instructions from their leaders. Wang Jingwei led a group of Wuhan's leadership over to Shanghai to discuss reunifying the KMT. Meanwhile, Jiang Zolin had dispatched a naval force, led by Admiral Bo Hai, who bombarded Shanghai's Wusong docks, providing ample incentives for the KMT to get their shit together quicker. On September the 7th, the KMT held meetings as the NRA began recrossing the Yangtze, anxious about the political decisions being made down south. The NRA forces landed at 4 points along the northern banks, and they would divide into 3 columns for an offensive. The right column advanced between the Grand Canal and the Yellow Sea, the middle column north along the railway, and the left column remained more stationary in Anhui, just in case the Wuhan 25,000-strong NRA forces there, led by Tong Shengji, should attack them. Meanwhile, down south, the KMT came to a temporary coalition known as the September Government. On the 14th, the meetings in Shanghai had progressed far enough that the delegates elected to expand them officially into a plenary session for the KMT's 4th National Assembly at Nanjing. The guys strongly backing this new coalition were mostly of the Guangxi clique, Generals Li Zongren and Bai Chongxi, and the Wuhan officials Sun Fo and Tan Yankai. Now, Li Zongren and Bai Chongxi held leverage over the Wuhan officials as their troops were literally in the vicinity of Nanjing. Wang Jingwei was hundreds of miles away with his commander-in-chief, Tong Shengji, thus he refused to recognize Nanjing as the seat of this new KMT government. Wang Jingwei also accused Sun Fo and Tan Yankai of betraying Wuhan's government and refused to travel with the others to Nanjing. Wang Jingwei departed Shanghai on September the 13th heading for Jiangxi. Over in Nanjing on the 15th, 13 KMT officials representing the Control Committee and the Military Council met as a collective body to officially create this coalition government. On the 19th, they gathered and agreed on specific compromises. The first was an agreement that Dr. Sun Yat-sen's 3 principles was still their doctrine. The second was to adhere to the KMT authority. Third was to oppose any CCP interference. And the fourth was to complete the Northern Expedition to reunify China. Looking at these terms, it would seem they were broad enough to please just about anybody in the KMT. However, the new coalition government did not have 2 of the largest KMT leaders behind it, Wang Jingwei and Chiang Kai-shek. Despite this, the KMT had grown to several million members by this point. Estimates are rough, but perhaps in 1926 they were something like 500,000, but by the end of the Northern Expedition this would turn into 5 million. Now the New September government faced a plethora of enemies, the first being Tongshengji up the Yangtze Valley, the second being the NPA in the North China Plain, and the third being the CCP insurgents all around them. Although decisively purged, the CCP had managed to goad some of Wuhan's NRA over to their new stronghold in Nanjing. Again, we will come back to what is the Chinese Civil War a little later on. I want to get through this warlord era stuff first. To be honest, there's so much overlapping in the later part of the 1920s, it's pretty hard to do it all chronologically. But to kind of brutally summarize, the CCP would form this kind of coup in early August aimed at taking control of Jiangxi. This was known as the Nanchang Uprising, and it lasted from August the 1st to the 4th. It would be followed up by armed uprisings in Jiangxi, Fujian, Guangdong, and a lot of other places. Yet all of these spectacularly failed, and the CCP resolved to maintain their existence through underground operations. The CCP gradually centralized itself, tightening discipline amongst the ranks and performing their own little purges. Now, to suppress the CCP menace on August the 10th, before his forced retirement, Chiang Kai-shek had ordered Li Zongren to carry out operations out of Guangdong into the CCP-held areas in Hunan and Jiangxi. By the 12th, Li Zongren's subordinate, Zhang Fenghui, also aided in the anti-CCP campaigns there. As for Tang Shengji, like Wang Jingwei, he too resisted joining the September government. In fact, he grabbed a large portion of the Wuhan KMT and NRA, and he went back to being a full-blown warlord. Basically, Tang Shengji saw an opportunity and he grabbed it. On August 21st, he pushed the Nanjing NRA forces of Wang Pu and Xia Toyin out of Anqing over in Anhui, and from there he advanced downriver along the southern bank, taking Wuhu on September the 6th. After taking Wuhu, Tang Shengji loosely held control over Hubei, Hunan, and Jiangxi, and some of the heartland of Anhui, since the Wuhan government had completely dissolved. He even had a few big generals under his command, such as Ho Chen, who was leading the 35th Army along the Yangtze's northern bank, and Li Xing, leading the 36th Army on the southern bank near Wuhu. Tang Shengji had profited heavily from Feng Yusung's entry into the war. When Feng Yusung had done so, Tang Shengji dispatched forces into southern Henan and he captured the Wushang Pass. Along the NRA's western flank, Tang Shengji's hostile presence greatly hampered their ability to focus north. Thus, September saw the Northern Expedition moving at a crawling pace. Many units shifted over to quell what was seen as Tang Shengji's rebellion, while the Central NRA forces maintained a bridgehead at Pukao against the NPA. The NRA vanguard advanced 25 miles north into Zhejiang. On October the 15th, the NRA began to move their forces up the banks of the Yangtze against Tang Shengji. The armies were led by Li Zongren and Chen Taoyuan on the north bank, and Chong Chen and Yue Kaixin on the south bank. Chu Peitei's Third Army threatened Tang Shengji around the Hunan-Jiangxi border. From the south, Li Qishen advanced his troops along the Guangdong border and would attack southern Hunan in early November. Basically, it was like a large encirclement maneuver. The main fighting against Tang Shengji would occur along the Yangtze, as Nanjing tossed forces upstream. The forces of Tang Shengji lost a war of attrition as the NRA surrounded them, cutting off their lines of communication and supply. Tang Shengji knew he would eventually be decisively defeated and most likely captured. Thus, Tang Shengji secretly got aboard a Japanese steamship on November the 12th and he went into exile in Japan. The NRA spent some more time clearing up the western flank until they finally could refocus their efforts against the NPA in the north. Ever since September, the bridgehead situation across the Yangtze remained fairly static. Now again, the NRA marched north and quickly advancing 30 miles while they captured Minquang in Anhui on November the 9th, followed by Fangyang on the 14th, and then they assaulted the capital of Bangbu on the 16th. Their offensive was concentrated along the Tianjin-Pukao Railway, but the NRA were avoiding frontal attacks against said line, as it was heavily fortified by railroad artillery. Jiang Zongchang's armored train specialization was heavily paying off for the NPA. To combat this, the NRA adopted sweeping tactics to try and outflank the NPA, striking into the rail communications in their rear. Meanwhile, the warlord armies were scouring the countryside to steal livestock, foodstuff, and coolies. But the peasants by this point had acquired their own skills, particularly the age-old practice of hiding their produce and vanishing before warlord gangs would show up. The NPA forces along their most southern fronts were beginning to really suffer because of this. Of course, word had also spread far and wide about the NRA's remarkable practice of paying for what they needed, thus the peasants were heavily aiding them. Sun Quan-fong launched a counterattack at Bangbu, trying to isolate the city from the NRA's southern lines of communication. However, this counterattack failed horribly, and he was yet again forced to withdraw his exhausted, demoralized men further north, now above the strategic White River Valley. The NRA were quick on their heels, continuously outflanking and circling them. In November, as Guoqian fell, Sun Quan-fong's forces found themselves shoved into the northernmost portion of Jiangsu, with their backs against some rugged hills. Further north, the dog-meat general stood ready with about 150,000 Shandong soldiers. Although allied with Sun Quan-fong, they were still bitter rivals. Jiang Zongchang chose to only collaborate with Sun Quan-fong when under attack by the NRA. Sun Quan-fong certainly had a difficult time coexisting with Jiang Zongchang and Shandong. To the northwest over the summer, as the NRA had pulled back south during the Battle of Longtan, Feng Yusung proved a great diversion for the NPA forces when he attacked Henan. Feng Yusung had been promised by Chiang Kai-shek a ton of money and vital war materials, thus he remained loyal to Nanjing after the Generalissimo's departure. General Hou Yingqin's 1st Army, the 9th Army, Xia Tuyin's new 10th Army, and Hou Yaozou's 14th Army were advancing towards Shuzhou and Jiangsu. 40 miles west, Po Wenwei's 33rd Army was advancing north to join up with Feng Yusung to assault the western approaches of Shuzhou. On December the 12th, the NPA tossed a counterattack down the railway from Shuzhou. The force consisted of 60,000 men under Jiang Zongchang and 10,000 from Sun Quan-fong. These two guys working together was a recipe for disaster. Jiang Zongchang's White Russian armored trains were the spearhead, supported by air squadrons, also flown by White Russians, and some Japanese, French, and Chinese pilots. The aircraft strafed NRA positions, proving themselves deadly and something for which the NRA had no real answer to. Jiang Zuolin had greatly expanded the Fengtian army's capabilities during the anti-Fengtian War. Though not enormous in number, the Fengtian held a decent air force and quite a few Renault tanks, but most importantly had the vast numerical superiority in heavy artillery and men. By December the 14th, however, the NPA counterattack began to ground to a halt, literally after 2 days of combat. The NRA then turned up the pressure from the west and the south, erecting a siege against Shuzhou. The city would fall on the 16th as Sun Quan-fong's entire front along the east-west Nonghuai Railway collapsed. This in turn forced the NPA to perform a hasty retreat over the border hills into Shandong, where they would dig in for the winter months. Do not forget, the NRA consisted almost entirely of southern Chinese who historically have never done well in winter, especially against northern Chinese. The NPA understood this advantage and they would make the best possible of it. The Jiang Zongchang-Sun Quan-fong joint operation was an abysmal failure. However, the unity in the new KMT government had its own problems. Just as soon as the NRA had dealt with Tong Shongju, a disgruntled element of the NRA decided to break off. The September government was lacking stability. Honestly, they lacked a generalissimo. Neither Wang Jingwei or Chiang Kai-shek were present, the only two men who really were popular enough amongst the masses. The only form of leadership now was loosely held by the Guangxi generals at Nanjing. Meanwhile, Wang Jingwei had angrily moved back over to Guangdong, where he began winning over some of the generals in Guangzhou. He was trying to rebuild a power base, seeking to recapture the KMT revolution. In dire need of support, Wang Jingwei became a lot more flexible with his politics. His image had already been stained by communism because of his former ties to the CCP and the Soviet Union. He began publicly telling people in March that he had been naive and that Chen Duxiu had seduced him with talk of CCP cooperation without conditions, but in fact it was Chiang Kai-shek that was correct about the communists. Wang Jingwei was now colluding with Zhang Fukuai, who retained some troops that had fought the communists in Jiangxi and Guangdong. There was also Xu Yue's division and Li Fulin's 5th Army, both Guangxi natives. However, Wang Jingwei had not been the only one trying to build a power base in Guangdong. So did the CCP. Zhang Fukui's primary job was to eliminate the pervading influence of the CCP in Guangzhou. They had never stopped creating mass organizations. Zhang Fukui's troops continuously rounded them up and kept an eye on the Soviet consulate at all times. The KMT were very well aware, most of the time, it was the Soviets pulling the strings, ordering CCP members around. During November, the CCP planned to seize Guangdong as their new revolutionary base. Through the Soviet consulate, Joseph Stalin sent orders in mid-November to step up armed activism throughout China. This would start with creating and controlling labor and peasant associations. The CCP played upon the low standard of living and the economic instability of warlord-era China, hoping to appeal to the masses for a Soviet communist-style system rather than what the KMT proposed. Here was a taste of some of the slogans they wrote on placards and proclaimed in major city centers. Raise the soldiers' pay to 20 silver dollars. Food for the workers. Land to the tillers. Knock down the KMT and the warlords. Kill all the country bullies and the evil landlords. Confiscate the capitalist homes and give them to the rebel masses. All authority to the workers, peasants, and soldiers. At one point, Chiang Kai-shek moved his anti-communist operations over to Hong Kong as they were seeing major strikes there. By late November, some Red Militia, including Dare to Die units, were being gathered by the CCP. In December, just as Wang Jingwei thought he was grasping at becoming politically relevant again, Guangdong fell into chaos. During early December, a large number of strikes sprang up, especially within Guangzhou. Then the CCP attempted a coup. The ringleaders were Zhang Tailei, the ex-leader of the Hong Kong strikers, and Su Jiaocheng, the ex-minister of labor at Wuhan. They led a red militia into the streets of Guangzhou during the early hours of December the 11th. The communists began by first seducing members of Chiang Kai-shek's army. When the morning light came up, their dare-to-die units and armed workers stormed police stations, grabbing the rifles, machine guns, and armored cars. They also took city buses and trucks to spread red militia throughout the city, who quickly stormed KMT government buildings and the central bank with its large silver reserves and barracks for more arms. To suppress resistance, the CCP began executing officers during the street fighting, marked and burnt down houses of KMT officials. Most of the communists were rural peasants, hoping their actions would jolt the urban workers to join them. Charging down the hills of Guangdong, remnants of the Red Army that had been fighting and retreating after the Nanjing uprising entered Guangzhou under Yue Ting's leadership. However bloody and successful the capture of Guangzhou may have been, it was certainly short-lived. Outside Guangzhou, Jiang Fukui, supported by Li Fulin's 5th NRA Army, some river gunboats, and those loyal to the KMT within the city outmanned and outgunned the communists. Hammer and sickle flags were torn down by December the 14th, after only 4 days of communist takeover. The anti-communist bloodbath that followed rinsed clean the Soviet collaborators from the consulate. Wang Jingwei professed to all that he, alongside his KMT leftist colleagues, were guiltless of the CCP coup. A few days prior to the uprising, as the plenary session prepared for the KMT's 4th Congress set for January, Wang Jingwei surprised everybody by calling for Chiang Kai-shek to be invited back to his post as commander-in-chief. The Chiang Kai-shek loyalists sprang on the issue. Chiang Kai-shek added his voice into the scene by calling for a cessation of any relations with Moscow. Nanjing implemented that straight away, closing all the Soviet consulates within the KMT territories, and they kicked the Soviet diplomats out. Now it seems Wang Jingwei was desperate to get back into the fold. So he was trying to play for a position at the head of the civilian KMT government while Chiang Kai-shek controlled the military. However, the Guangzhou uprising stained him with further communist suspicion. Yet again it seemed the curtains were falling down upon Wang Jingwei. On December the 17th, he boarded a steamer bound for France. His ship would stop at Hong Kong, but he did not bother to even step ashore. Like the Soviets, he was being kicked out of China again. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, and found on all podcast platforms. Over at YouTube, I just released a long-form documentary on the First Sino-Japanese War. As for podcasts, I've now released episode 4 in an ongoing series on the North Africa campaign during World War II. If you'd like to support me more personally, why don't you check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Over there, for just $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all of my content, and voting rights for what I will tackle next. Over there we just rounded poll, and it seems the next episode is going to be on a alternate history. What if Japan attacked the USSR during World War II? The rivalry between the Wuhan and Nanjing KMT governments had come to an end. A new September government unified the KMT, however, they lacked any real leadership in the forms of Wang Jingwei or Chiang Kai-shek. The Guangxi clique generals were trying to keep things together, but it was simply not the same. At some point, someone had to become generalissimo again.